Hey there, and welcome to NarrativeFlow. My name is Mitch. I'm the creator of NarrativeFlow. In this video, I'm going to be walking you through part one of the three-part walkthrough on how to become a master of NarrativeFlow. Now, if you don't know what NarrativeFlow is, go ahead and check out narrativeflow.dev. NarrativeFlow empowers you, an awesome narrative designer, whether you are an indie entrepreneur or a AAA veteran, with the tools, clarity, and creative freedom to design the video game stories you have always wanted to tell. And you get to do this all without coding or designing your narrative as CSVs, as comma separated values, or using outdated tools or being limited in any way. If you're watching this video on YouTube, there are some links down in the description below. One link will take you to NarrativeFlow's website, and the other will take you to the documentation page where you will find this video on there, as well as a text-based version of the walkthrough and several other resources for you to get started and become a master. Let's hop right into part one of the walkthrough. In this video, we're going to go over how to create experiences, how to create narrative chains in an experience, what a narrative chain is, what nodes are, how to connect them together to make narrative chains. We're going to talk about the start node, end node, dialogue node, and choice node. We're then going to go over how to define narrative variables for your narrative so that you can track things, branch your narrative, how to branch your dialogue, and change your narrative, take different routes depending on what values one or more variables might have. I'll then show you how to modify your variables at any point in your narrative. I'll then show you how to test variables with a conditional node to take one or more different routes depending on the value of one or more variables. And the last part of this walkthrough, I will show you how to use variables as dynamic content in your narrative. So if your player is able to enter dynamic information that's unique to them, or if their narrative journey through your video game is unique, you'll be able to easily insert and use that dynamic content in your narrative. All right, let's hop right into part one of the walkthrough. In your left panel here, go ahead and make sure that your experiences tab is selected, and we got to create an experience. You can either do that by clicking the new experience button here. You can also right click in the blank area here and click new experience. You can also right click on your project root, so to speak. This represents your entire project where all of your experiences will be stored. So you can right click on that, click new experience. If you want to rename your project, you can rename it right there. I'm just going to click this button up here, and I will name this Experience 1. Experiences store all of your narrative chains, and you can have as many experiences as you want, and you can organize them into folders. Like I said, you can have as many experiences as you want, and you get to decide how you want to create and organize your narrative chains. So if your video game is perhaps more linear, you might have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, etc. If your game is more dynamic and the player is allowed to talk to individual characters such as companions in an RPG, you might have an experience per companion. You could also have an experience for tutorials or an experience for every in-game computer terminal that the player can interact with and read. So now that we've got our experience created, we need to open it here in the main workspace. To do that, simply double click it, and you can see we've got our toolbar that just popped up here for us. Next, we need to create our first node. Now you can click this button up here, create node, and choose the node that you want to create. You can also simply right click anywhere in the workspace when you're in the nodes mode. I'm just going to right click and let's choose create start node. Now, what are start nodes? Start nodes are necessary for your game engine to know where to find a specific narrative chain. I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. Let's real quick create an end node. So right click and choose create end node. Now that we've got our two nodes, let's connect them up and create our first narrative chain. All you need to do is left click on the output of the start node and drag it over to your end node and lift your mouse cursor. And congratulations, you've created your first narrative chain. You are well on your way to becoming a master. Let's go ahead and create a dialogue node next. Go ahead and right click, choose create dialogue node, and we need to insert this dialogue node into our chain here. In order to do that, we're going to have to move some of these nodes around. You can left click and hold. You can click basically anywhere on a node to move them around your graph anywhere you want. You can also easily zoom out, zoom in with your mouse scroll wheel. You can also use the zoom out and in buttons up here. You can also pan your view by holding right click with your mouse and dragging. You right click on a blank area and drag your mouse. You can also do that with the middle mouse button. Now, what do you do if you are on a laptop and you just have a trackpad, you don't have a mouse? Well, if you hold spacebar or shift, either one works, left click on the graph and drag, it does the exact same thing as right click and middle click on a mouse. Now, in order to insert this dialog node in this chain, we need to break the current chain. To do that, we just hover over the link and you right click. Now let's connect our start node to our dialog node. And I'm going to leave this unconnected because we're going to insert a choice node in a minute. But before we insert that choice node, let's show you how to edit nodes, how to edit the information that's stored in the node. You can see here our start node needs a name. Our dialog node does not have a source defined and it doesn't have any dialog defined. So how do we put in that information? Let's start by editing the dialog node. This button right here is the button that will open up the node editor to edit your node. Go ahead and click that. And ta-da, we've got our node editor. Now, before I walk you through what everything here means, what it does for you, I want to explain something real quick. You'll see that I named dialog node D-I-A-L-O-G, not D-I-A-L-O-G-U-E. It's because in video game narrative, there's a lot of text, a lot of information, a lot of narrative that's not just conversations between people. I mentioned earlier how you could have an experience that contains every narrative chain for computer terminals that the player character can interact with and read. Well, that would be dialogue without the UE, not dialogue with UE, which tends to represent conversations between characters, if that makes sense. Let's hop back into edit our dialog node, and we're going to start with the dialog source here. I'll explain these buttons in just a minute. Let's start with the dialog source though. The dialog source is the character or object or source of what you're going to put here. So in this case, I'm going to put a character's name. I'll say Evelyn, and in the dialogue, I'll say hello, traveler. So now we've got Evelyn is the person talking, the person saying something, and this is what they're saying. You can see that what we wrote in dialogue displays down here in this area called presented text. This may not make a lot of sense right now until you start using text styles. I'll explain what text styles do in a later part of this walkthrough, so don't worry about those right now. Just focus on your dialog source and your dialogue. There's also this area down here for node properties. This is where you would attach a VO file, any other data you want. So if you want to, for example, display a specific image, a lot of RPGs do this, or games like Stardew Valley, where they will display a certain image, like a character's expression, along with each piece of dialogue. This is where you would add that information so that your game engine knows what voiceover file to play, what expression to show. You can also put camera angles there, animations, etc. Any data you want your game engine to know that you want associated with this dialogue, you would add here. Now that we're done editing our dialog node, go ahead and click done, and let's right click and create a choice node next. Now by default, choices will only have one choice. They must have at least one choice, but you can add as many choices as you want, literally hundreds if that's what you want. Let's go ahead and connect this up into our narrative chain that we've got here. And then let's click the edit node button to open the choice node in the node editor. You'll see that the node editor obviously looks a little bit different because we're editing a choice node, not a dialog node. Once again, I'll explain what these buttons do later. You can also see that choice nodes have properties as well, which I will also explain later in this walkthrough. Let's go ahead and add a second choice. We'll have two choices here, and I'm just going to enter A and B. You can see as we typed, what we typed up here, the choices that we've defined show up down here as presented text. Once again, don't worry about this right now. It'll make a lot of sense once you learn what text styles do and how to use text styles. Now that we're done editing our choice node, go ahead and click done. And you can see since we added a second choice, our choice node is displaying both of them now. And our first choice is already hooked up to the end node. Our second choice isn't hooked up to anything though. So let's go ahead and create a second end node, and we can plug that in there. And with this, you've actually created your first branch in NarrativeFlow. NarrativeFlow lets you have unlimited branches, and you get to route them through your narrative however you want. Now that we've created our first narrative chain, I'm going to show you how to define narrative variables for your narrative, and I will show you how variable nodes work and conditional nodes work. So to get started defining narrative variables for your narrative, go ahead and click the variables button here. This is going to open up the variables modal. The variables modal here looks pretty simple because we haven't defined any variables. Go ahead and click the new variable group. In NarrativeFlow, you can either put all of your variables in one group, which you may want to do if you don't have many variables for your narrative, which some games don't need a lot. Let's say though that you are developing a large AAA RPG, you may want several dozen groups. For example, you could have one group for your main story narrative variables. You could have another one for side quests or side quests from specific regions. You may have variables that are specific to different characters in your story. You could also have a group of variables that are kind of some global variables. They are used through your whole narrative, right? You can easily rename any variable group. So like I said, you could do main story variables. For our purposes here in the walkthrough, what am I going to name this? I'll just name this example. That's a very original group name. All right, so we have 3 fields to fill out per variable. This right here, this group of 3 different fields, this is one variable definition. You can add as many variable definitions as you need. You can also have as many groups as you need. And let's say you had multiple groups in here, you can collapse and expand your groups just by clicking on the header, and then you can remove group by clicking the remove group button. Any variable definitions you don't need, just hit the X next to them. You must have at least one variable in a group because it doesn't make sense to have a group without any variables. So these 3 fields, what do they each mean? What do they each do? This first field here is the label. What you put here will show up on the context menu when you are inserting this variable into your narrative. If that didn't make any sense, don't worry. I'm going to show you exactly what this means after we define a couple of variables. The variable field is where you're going to put the name of your variable, the actual text that represents your variable. And then default value is the default value that variable holds. So I'm going to create a couple of variables here to demonstrate how variables work in NarrativeFlow, how you interact with them, use them, insert them into your nodes, etc. So I'm going to name this one, did player choose A or B? And this is the label. This is what I'm going to click on to insert this variable into our narrative. And this variable holds this default value. So I'm going to give this the identifier of did player choose A or B? And you'll notice I put this in square brackets. Now, why did I do that? I will explain why I put my variable in square brackets. You do not have to do this, but I will explain why I did that and why you may want to do something at least similar to it. You get to decide how you do it. NarrativeFlow will not force you to do it one way or another. I will explain why I did that, though, and why you may want to do something similar when I show you how to use variables as dynamic content a little bit later in this video. For now, I'm going to give it a default value of A. You could also do none if you don't want this to have a default value of A or B. In your narrative, you could check this and say, hey, did player choose A or B equal none? Well, then you know that choice hasn't even been made yet, right? For my purposes, I'm just going to say A. The next variable here, I'm going to say player's name, and then once again in square brackets, player's name. And the default value, I'm going to put Quinn. All right, now that we've defined our 2 example variables, go ahead and just click the done button up here to close the variables modal. And the next thing we're going to do is create a variable node. We're actually going to create 2 variable nodes, but let's start with just the one. And I'm going to insert this variable node in between the A choice and the end node for the A choice. Variable nodes are how we're going to change the value of the variable that we defined in the variables modal. So go ahead and open the variable node in the node editor. Variable nodes just have one assignment by default. You can easily add as many as you need. There are no restrictions with how many variables you can change at once in one variable node. So in our case, what we want to do is we want to change the value of our variable that we defined in the variables modal. We want to change it based on the choice that the player makes here. In this case, if the player chooses A, then we want to set that variable as A. Now, NarrativeFlow has a really cool feature that allows you to very quickly insert any variables that you've defined. So right here is where we want to insert our variable. Right here is where we want to put our variable name, and right here is the value that we want to assign to it. In this case, we want to assign the letter A. So what we're going to do is click on this field here, make sure that it's selected, that your cursor is in here, then just click this button up here, Insert Variable, and you'll see a list of all the variables that you've defined. You can even see the group name up here. Remember when I talked about the label field and I said I would explain that later, and how the label field is what you would click on to insert a variable? This right here is whatever we put in the label field. So if we were to go change that label field, these names would change. So just go ahead and click Did Player Choose A or B? And you'll see that it automatically inserted the variable for us, the identifier, not the label, but the actual variable for us. And in this case, we want to assign the letter A to it, and we're done. We have created our first assignment. Go ahead and click Done on the node editor. Then we need to create a second variable node and insert it in between choice B and this other end node. Now, instead of right-clicking, creating a new variable, and configuring it, which you can totally do, you can also click on this node and hit Control D, or right-click on the header and click Duplicate, or click on the three dots and click Duplicate. So now just route up your new variable node to the second choice there, to choice B, and then open the new variable node in the node editor, change this to B, and you're done. And there you go. Defining and modifying narrative variables for your narrative is that simple. Now let's move on to conditional nodes. I'm going to create a new experience to show conditional nodes to you. So go ahead and create a new one, experience 2, double click it to open it up. And then I'm going to create a start node and an end node, and I'm going to create a conditional node. Now you can see that conditional nodes have two outputs by default. You have the one route that's already created for us by default, and you have a default route. So I'm going to create another end node for the default route. Don't worry, I'll explain what this does in a second. Let's just get our chain here all hooked up. Next, go ahead and open up your conditional node to edit it. Now, conditional nodes are used to test a variable, to check if it's equal to a certain value or less than a certain value. You can see all the comparisons that you can do here: equal to, not equal to, less than, greater than, etc. You can check your variables, test your variables with any of these operators here. In our case, I'm just going to do equal to. Next, we want to insert the variable that we created earlier. So select your variable field here. Click on Insert Variable, and did player choose A or B? In this case, we want to check did player choose A or B, to check if it is equal to A. Just like variable nodes, choice nodes, and everything else in NarrativeFlow, you can add as many comparisons as you want. So if you want to take a route only if many variables pass a certain check, you can add as many comparisons as you want. And if you want more than one route, you can add multiple routes with as many comparisons per route as you need. Let's click Done and see what our node looks like now. You can see the comparison that we defined is now showing up here. Routes in conditional nodes by default are configured with a setting to only take the route if all the comparisons equate to true. We can change that though by hitting this drop down and saying all, any, or none. Just like everything else in NarrativeFlow, you can create as many comparisons as you like. You can also create as many routes as you like. So if you need a comparison node with 50 routes, you can do that. For now, we only need the one route and we only need the one comparison. Now, how do conditional nodes work, and what is this default route? Well, we have configured this conditional node with only one route, and to only take this route if all of the comparisons equate to true. So in our case, with one comparison, did player choose A or B? Is that variable equal to A? In the case that variable is equal to A, then we'll take this route. In the case that this is equal to B or something else entirely, or if you had other routes and other comparisons and other settings of all, any, or none, and none of your routes defined were considered valid, that is when the default route would be taken. Now, let's say you had a situation in which you didn't want the default route. You did not want to create a separate branch for the default route. Let me give you an example. Let's go ahead and open up our conditional node. I am going to add another route. I am going to insert the same did player choose A or B, and for the value I'm going to say B. So I'm creating a comparison in which a conditional node in which I have two routes, one for equal to A, one for equal to B, and I'm going to wire this one up. In this case, we, as the creators, as the narrative designers, we know that did player choose A or B will only ever equal A or B. And so we know that this default route will never be taken. In this case, it is more than acceptable for you to just wire up this default route to any of the routes, any of the same destinations as your routes. So in this case, I'll just hook it up to the same destination as Route 2. Now at this point, you might have a question on your mind, and that question is, how do I get my narrative to jump between one experience to another? Thankfully, there is a solution built into NarrativeFlow that makes this very, very easy. That solution comes in the form of teleport nodes. So what we're going to do first is we need to give our start node a name. In NarrativeFlow, all start nodes, in order to be considered valid, need to have a unique name. Now that name does not have to be unique to your whole project. It just simply needs to be unique to each experience. So you can have multiple start nodes in any given experience. I gave the example earlier of, let's say you have an experience for all of the conversations between the player and, say, a certain companion. You may have multiple start nodes in that one experience of conversations between the player character and that companion, with each start node representing the start of a different narrative chain, a different conversation with that character in a different context, in a different setting, after a certain event has happened in the story, etc. The names of start nodes must be unique in the experience. So you cannot have two start nodes in the same experience with the same name. You can have start nodes with the same name if those start nodes are in different experiences. In our case, I'm just going to give this one the name of experience 2 start, and then I'm going to jump back to experience 1 and give this the name of experience 1 start. Then I'm going to wire up, instead of having end nodes, I'm actually going to select both of these. You can either hit delete or backspace to remove them, or you can hit the three dots and say remove selected nodes, or you can right click and say remove selected nodes. Then I'm going to create a teleport node. I'm going to do this by clicking on the output of this variable node and then just dropping it on the graph here. And when I select create teleport node, you'll see that it automatically connected for us. Then I'm going to wire up the second variable node. Teleport nodes allow you to easily jump between your various experiences. It allows a narrative chain in one experience to connect seamlessly to a narrative chain in another. So let's open up our teleport node. We need to select our destination experience. In this case, our destination experience is our second one. And then we need to select a destination start node. Now, remember how I said start nodes must have a name to be considered valid? If a start node that you're trying to connect to, that you want to teleport to, does not have a name, it will not show up in this list. Only named start nodes can show up in this list and be teleported to. Thankfully, we gave ours a name, so we'll select experience 2 start, and we've configured our teleport node. All right, now that we know how to jump our narrative seamlessly between experiences, let's now talk about how to use variables as dynamic content. You'll remember that we defined a second variable, in this case, player's name, with a default value of Quinn. Now, let's say that this variable, in my game engine, I let the player rename their main character, to give the main player character their own unique name. Then in my narrative, like in dialogue, etc., I want to display that unique name. Thankfully, this is extremely easy to do in NarrativeFlow. We've already defined our player's name variable here. We've given it a default value. And all we need to do is let's use this dialog node as an example. So instead of saying hello traveler, we want to say hello and then the name of the name that the player gave to their character. So in this case, I'm going to erase what's there and I'm going to go up here, insert variable, and I'm going to click player's name. Now you'll see that the variable was inserted here exactly as we typed it, not the label, but the variable identifier itself was inserted in there. You'll also see in the presented text area that NarrativeFlow automatically replaced any variables it found with the default value here. So presented text gives you a representation of the text you wrote here, of the information you put here. Presented text is a representation of how this text could look to your player in your game engine when running in your game. Now, when we defined our variables in the variables modal, I said that I would explain why I decided to make the identifier for the variable, why I used square brackets around the variable name, the variable identifier. That's because NarrativeFlow, for every variable that you define, NarrativeFlow will be constantly looking through your narrative for variables. And whenever it finds text that matches the identifier, the name for your variable, it will replace that variable with the default value of that variable. So let's say that we had defined a variable with a name and identifier of a common word or a common phrase. If we were to use that word or that phrase in our narrative, either in dialogue or in choices, NarrativeFlow would replace that word, even if we didn't want that word to be used as a variable. NarrativeFlow would replace that word with the default value of your variable. And when your game is running in your game engine, instead of it being replaced with the default value, it would be replaced with the value of that variable at that time. So by using square brackets in our variable identifiers, our variable names, it helps us avoid words or phrases that we intend to use as words or phrases. It helps us prevent NarrativeFlow from thinking that those are variables. So I highly recommend using something like square brackets or curly braces or parentheses or however you want to differentiate your variables from common words or phrases. Doing that is completely optional. I try to make NarrativeFlow such that it will never force you to do something one specific way. So don't feel like you have to put your variables in square brackets. Nonetheless, it is recommended to avoid conflicts with your regular narrative, common words and phrases that you might use. Variables can be inserted pretty much anywhere. So I could come into the choice node, and instead of saying A and B, let's select player's name. And instead of the choices being A and B, and instead of the choices being A and player's name, the choices will be presented to the player as A and, in our case, the default value. But in real time, it will be parsed as whatever value the player put as their player's name. So if the player named their character Maxwell would show up in the game engine instead of player's name, instead of Quinn, the default value, and instead of B, like we had earlier. Let me give you another example. Let's go ahead and go to variables, add a new variable called player's reputation. And I'm going to give that a default value, let's say of 0. Or maybe you wanted to give them a little bit more reputation at the start of your game. So let's say 50, right? 50 out of 100 or something. I'm also going to create another variable, and I'm going to call it required reputation. And in this case, I'm going to say 35. Sure. Doesn't matter. I'm simply just using this to help explain to you how we can use variables. Let's go to our second experience, open up the conditional. And you know what? No, let's create a new conditional node so that we don't confuse ourselves. In this case, I'm going to put is the player's reputation. And in this case, I want to say is the player's reputation greater than, and this is where you can use variables as dynamic content instead of putting a static value here, like 35 or a, etc. I can insert the variable here. In this case, required reputation. So is the player's reputation greater than the required reputation? In this case, we will take route 1 if this comparison is true. So that's a brief overview of how you can use variables in dynamic ways. You can also use variables in properties and many, many other areas of narrative flow. Now, one last thing before we finish this part 1 of the walkthrough is let's talk about quick access. Now, when you're writing narrative, when you're designing narrative, I'm sure you have experienced this before, where you have certain terms or phrases that you're going to be typing over and over and over again. The names of characters, names of regions, etc. And sometimes these names, especially if you're working on something fantasy or sci-fi, sometimes these names can be quite complex. They don't roll off the tongue when typing, so to speak. Thankfully, NarrativeFlow has a really cool feature to save not only our fingers from typing such complex things over and over again, but also saves our brain from having to think about it. So go ahead and click Quick Access here. This will open up the Quick Access modal, and then we're going to create a new item group. This is very similar to the variables modal. We can group our Quick Access items. In this case, I'm just going to say complex names, or you know what? Let's just call it character names, and we can put all of our character names here. So for example, let's say I have, do I know how to spell that? I do know how to spell that. Congratulations, me. And the value that I want to put in is exactly what I just typed in the label. And we've created our first quick access item. Let's click done. And I'm just going to create a new dialog node here. So let's say that you had to insert a character's name over and over again in this dialog source, or rather type it over and over again, right? Well, we can put our cursor in there, make sure that's selected, our cursor's in there, click quick access, click William Shakespeare, and boom, it was that easy. I did not have to type that out and make typos and embarrass myself because I don't know how to spell William Shakespeare. You can add as many items as you want, as many groups as you want. This will save you a ton of time for terms, phrases, words, etc. that you will be inserting over, or that you will be putting in your narrative over and over and over again. There are also some really cool things you can do with quick access. You can combine it with variables and text styles, or terms and text styles, to make inserting certain phrases that you want highlighted or bolded or colored the same way every single time. Quick access makes it extremely easy, saves you a lot of time, and reduces a lot of repetition. Now, the last thing that is important to know before we're done with part 1 of this walkthrough, I know quick access, I said that was the last thing, but I forgot about problems and errors. So you need to know how to solve problems and errors. It's very, very important. When you see a red circle up here, it means that there's an error in your narrative. If this were yellow, it would mean that there are just warnings in your narrative. Errors mean that there are problems with the narrative, a narrative chain, some logical problem that really needs to be solved, especially before you export, you compile your narrative to publish your game. You may also want to solve these before you compile it to test in your game engine. Go ahead and switch to the problems tab now. We can look at all of the problems with our that are in our project now. So in this case, we can see that we've got 4 errors and 1 warning. Thankfully, problems and errors in NarrativeFlow are fairly easy to solve. It's also very easy to navigate directly to where the problem is. If you click this button, it will take you directly to the node with the error. In this case, I know that it's this node, and these errors are associated with this dialog node. So to fix this error, I would just need to connect links to this node and connect this node to other nodes to make sure that there are no unconnected inputs or outputs. So to solve that for this conditional node, I'm just going to remove the node. And instead of deleting this dialog node, I want to talk to you about the warning first. The warning in this case, this dialog node has no text. This is technically valid. You may, in your game, want to have a dialog box or a sign or a computer terminal or a book or something in which no text is displayed. I'm not saying that's going to be common. Nonetheless, it is valid and you may have a reason to do it. That's why NarrativeFlow does not consider an empty dialog field. It does not consider it as an error, but rather as a warning, something that is valid but may have been unintended, is most likely to be unintended. So in this case, we can go add text to that warning would go away. And then of course, make sure your dialog node is a part of your chain. So I'll just hook it up here and we can see that those errors went away. Our warning, we can solve by just putting in some dialog. And hey, look at that. We have no problems, no errors, no warnings. Now I showed you that button that when you click it, it'll take you to that node. It's a right-facing arrow when we are in the experience with the problem. But let's say I was in experience 1, you'll see it's a different symbol. And that symbol, when you click it, what it will do is automatically open up the associated experience. It'll take you to that node that has the error. All right, that wraps up part 1 of the walkthrough. If you are watching this on YouTube, there will be a link in the description to part 2 of the walkthrough. Go ahead and get started with that after you subscribe. If you're watching this on the narrativeflow.dev documentation pages, there will be a link to part 2 somewhere nearby. Thank you so much for watching this video and for checking out NarrativeFlow. I am so excited to see everything that you create with NarrativeFlow. You have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in part 2.